Andrew Whitmore had everything money could buy, but he was failing every test and being called a disappointment by his own millionaire father. Jonathan believed nothing could save his son, especially a lowly cleaning lady, whom he humiliated every day. But what no one imagined was that this same cleaning lady was harboring a powerful secret. A secret that would transform not only the boy everyone considered a failure, but also silence the millionaire himself inside his mansion. The Whitmore mansion stood imposingly in the hills of Hartford, Connecticut, like a modern castle defying time. Its wrought iron gates opened onto meticulously manicured gardens, marble fountains, and sculptures imported from Europe. Inside, long hallways displayed works of art valued in the millions, but which for the residents were no more than static decoration. Luxury was omnipresent, but human warmth seemed to have been banished from every room, as if the walls glittered only to display power. Here lived Jonathan Whitmore, a 45-year-old financial tycoon, accustomed to turning numbers into fortunes, but incapable of turning silence into dialogue within his own home. Jonathan spent his days immersed in virtual meetings, surrounded by reports and bright screens reflecting off his glasses. His eyes were cold as steel, always seeking profit but never seeing weakness. For him, success was synonymous with dominance, and any sign of weakness was treated as a disease to be eliminated. His greatest pride should have been his son Andrew, his 17-year-old heir, but with each report card, that pride turned to shame. Andrew, possessed of every conceivable privilege, was a string of failures. Blank exams, failing grades, teachers quitting one after the other. The young man, seated in one of the enormous halls, seemed out of place within a throne he didn't desire. He had everything: cars, travel, access to the best schools, but he carried an emptiness greater than any mansion. His eyes searched for distractions on his cell phone while his father scolded him, repeating the same sentence over and over, "You're a disappointment." With each word, Andrew sank deeper into a sea of apathy, convinced he was nothing more than a spectator in his own life. What no one imagined was that, within that house full of luxury and silence, an almost invisible presence was beginning to notice what Jonathan was unable to see. A humble, underestimated presence, one that held within itself a secret capable of turning the entire Whitmore family's destiny upside down. Mornings at the mansion always began with the same ritual. Jonathan sitting at the head of the dining table, the financial newspaper open in front of him, and Andrew silent, staring at the plate he rarely touched. The news spoke of conquests, million-dollar mergers, victories for the Whitmore empire. But within the family, the word victory seemed non-existent. Andrew had failed math, accumulated absences in literature, and, to top it all off, had even failed in sports where his classmates mocked his lack of energy. Jonathan couldn't understand how someone with all the resources at his disposal could be so incapable. Tutors would arrive with folders full of sophisticated methods and leave slamming doors in frustration. It's not that he doesn't understand, it's that he doesn't try, they would mutter, certain that Andrew was a lost cause. Jonathan, hearing these stories, felt his blood boil. For him, this wasn't just an academic failure. It was an attack on the Whitmore legacy. The son who was supposed to inherit one of the country's greatest fortunes couldn't even solve a simple equation. His father's pride turned to shame in front of his fellow council members, and this was unbearable for a man who never admitted defeat. Andrew, however, carried another kind of torment. For him, nothing made sense. The books were just blocks of disconnected words. The formulas were nothing more than lifeless symbols. With each failure, the adult's disbelief grew, and with it the feeling of being trapped in a gilded prison. Loneliness echoed through the mansion's corridors, and Andrew became convinced there was nothing inside him worth discovering. His father saw only failure, and the teachers had already given up. But there was someone who still watched him silently, seeing not the uselessness, but the emptiness that begged to be filled. Someone who, despite being humiliated daily, held within herself the key that could unlock the doors of Andrew's mind and heart. Margaret Collins walked the halls of the Whitmore mansion with light, almost invisible steps. At 38, her life was made up of silent journeys, dusting expensive furniture, polishing marble floors, and maintaining order in a palace that would never be hers. Despite her discretion, she was a frequent target of Jonathan's contempt. Whenever he passed her, the millionaire never missed a chance to make cutting remarks, reminding her that she shouldn't know much. After all, she never studied. Each word sounded like a sentence, as if her simplicity were an unforgivable flaw amidst the glitter of luxury. Andrew had watched these scenes countless times. Sitting on the living room sofa, he pretended not to hear, but inside, every remark his father made against the cleaning lady bothered him more than he cared to admit. Margaret didn't respond. She just lowered her head and continued her work with a silent dignity that diffused any attack. To Jonathan, it was insignificant. To Andrew, there was something intriguing about it. How could someone endure so much humiliation without breaking? This mysterious force was beginning to awaken questions he had never dared to ask aloud. One afternoon, Jonathan, angered after receiving another embarrassing report card from his son, decided to take it out on Margaret. "Look, Andrew," he said, pointing to the cleaning lady scrubbing the floor. "She never studied, never knew anything, and look where you've ended up. Do you want to end up like her?" Andrew swallowed hard, but something burned in his chest. Margaret looked up for a moment, and, contrary to what everyone expected, there was no shame there. There was firmness. It was in that silent gaze that Andrew realized there was much more behind this invisible woman than his father could ever understand. That night, Andrew couldn't sleep. The echo of his father's words still throbbed in his mind, but what disturbed him most was Margaret's steady gaze. He wondered how someone so despised could carry in her eyes something that conveyed strength and certainty. For the first time, Andrew realized there was a different presence in the mansion, almost invisible, but capable of seeing things no one else could. While everyone simply called him lazy and a failure, Margaret seemed to see beyond, as if she could penetrate the walls of apathy that imprisoned him. The next day, Andrew found her in the backyard, where she was patiently gathering dry leaves. He sat silently, feigning distraction, but watching her every move. There was no rush, no irritation, just a mindful attention to the little things no one noticed. Margaret looked up and, without judgment, simply smiled slightly. "Have you ever noticed," she said softly, "how each fallen leaf tells the story of the tree that let it go?" Andrew was silent, but those simple words rang deeper than any lecture he had ever taken. For the first time, something made him want to listen. Andrew couldn't understand why, but he was beginning to realize that Margaret saw the world in a completely different way. Where he saw only failure and emptiness, she saw details, connections, and hidden meanings. It was as if she had a secret that lay not in the expensive books stacked in the library, but in the way she observed life. And for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a spark ignite within him, a desire to discover what else this woman, so underestimated, could teach him. Andrew began to observe Margaret with growing curiosity. As she cleaned the hallways or organized the books in the library, her calm gestures revealed something different, a quiet order that didn't depend on diplomas or titles. One afternoon, upon entering the library to escape his father's criticism, Andrew found her sitting in a corner, resting for a few minutes. In her hands was not a trendy cell phone or a gossip magazine, but an old notebook with a worn cover, filled with handwritten notes. He approached slowly, intrigued, and asked, "What are you writing there?" Margaret closed the notebook carefully, but not with embarrassment. "Just things I learned from observing life," she replied. Andrew frowned. "But you didn't even study." The comment was fraught with the same prejudice she'd heard from her father, but Margaret wasn't offended. She simply looked at him and said, "The world is the greatest book there is. Those who pay attention learn much more than they imagine." The naturalness with which she spoke left Andrew disconcerted. He asked to see the notebook. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret handed it to him. Opening it, Andrew found short sentences and profound metaphors. Comparisons between people and seasons, between decisions and rivers, between pride and the dust that accumulates if left unwashed. They weren't mathematical formulas, but somehow they made more sense than any tutoring lesson. Andrew closed the notebook slowly, his heart pounding. For the first time, he wanted to know more, and he felt that perhaps the key to escape the labyrinth he lived in lay, hidden precisely in the woman his father so despised. In the days that followed, Andrew began to seek out small moments of closeness with Margaret. He would find her in the garden, the pantry, or even in the hallway, where she deftly balanced buckets and cloths. She always began with simple, almost timid questions, but with each answer, the feeling was the same. There was more wisdom in those short sentences than in all the books he had piled on the table without ever opening. Margaret spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the seasons, household chores, but she transformed each detail into a metaphor for life. To Andrew, who had grown accustomed to hearing only criticism or orders, this felt like an otherworldly discovery. One rainy afternoon, as Margaret scrubbed the floor of the main hall, Andrew approached and asked why she never seemed to complain, even though her father treated her with such contempt. She stopped for a moment, looked at him and said, "The dirt always comes back, Andrew. But if you learn to clean again, you realize that effort isn't punishment. It's practice. Life is the same." The boy fell silent, reflecting. No one had ever explained life to him that way. He thought of effort as punishment, failure as destiny. But in Margaret's words, everything seemed to be a cycle, and each attempt, no matter how small, carried value. For the first time, Andrew began to wonder if his failures weren't signs of inability, but just part of a training he never wanted to endure. These conversations, almost hidden in the corners of the mansion, became a ray of light in her gray routine. What once seemed like a dead end began to fill with questions, and these questions gave her the energy to carry on. Jonathan, oblivious to this approach, remained convinced that his son was dead weight destined for failure. But Margaret saw something different. She saw a boy suffocated by the weight of expectations that never belonged to him. And each time she opened her mouth to share one of her simple secrets, she didn't just speak, she planted seeds. Seeds that, sooner or later, would begin to break through the hard soil of apathy and germinate into something impossible to ignore. One silent night, Andrew sat at his bedroom desk, staring at yet another blank sheet of paper. It was a literature assignment that was due a few days ago. He considered tearing up the paper and giving up, as he always did, but then he remembered a phrase from Margaret's notebook. Words carry the weight of those who live them, not those who repeat them. It lingered in his mind. Reluctantly, he picked up his pen and, for the first time in a long time, decided to try writing not what the teacher expected but what he felt. The lines began timidly, but soon transformed into sentences filled with images and metaphors he hadn't even known he was capable of creating. He wrote about the silent mansion, about the long corridors that seemed to imprison him, about the rain in the garden as if it were a mirror of the tears he never let fall. When he finished, he realized he had written 3 entire pages without noticing the passage of time. For the first time, he looked at his work and felt proud. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. The next day, he handed in the paper expecting nothing more than another red mark. But when the professor read it, he frowned and asked Andrew to stay after class. "Where did this come from?" he asked, holding up the papers with a surprised expression. Andrew didn't know what to say. He simply shrugged, hiding the fact that the inspiration had come from the cleaning lady his father had so humiliated. The grade hadn't yet been revealed, but the professor's reaction was already a clear sign. There was a spark hidden within him, and that small spark, if nurtured, could become the fire capable of completely transforming his life. The next morning, Andrew entered the classroom carrying the same weight. The stares of his classmates, the silent judgment of his teachers. Everyone was used to seeing him as the useless heir, someone who lived off the scraps of the Whitmore name. But something different began to spread that day. The literature teacher, still overwhelmed by his essay, asked Andrew to read excerpts aloud to the class. The boy's heart raced. The idea of expressing his thoughts seemed like a nightmare. Nevertheless, he took a deep breath and began to read. The words, simple yet powerful, echoed through the room. The class, accustomed to mocking him, fell silent. Some frowned, others leaned forward, curious. The text spoke of loneliness, of feeling trapped in a place full of riches but empty of meaning. It was raw, true. When he finished, there was no laughter or jokes. There was only a dense silence, followed by some timid applause, and on the teacher's face, a rare gleam of pride. For the first time, Andrew wasn't seen as a failure. He was seen as someone capable of seeing beyond the surface. The news spread quickly through the halls. The tycoon's son, the same one who always got bad grades, had impressed a teacher. For some, it was just a passing surprise. For others, a hint that perhaps Andrew wasn't as empty as everyone thought. The young man returned home with a different feeling in his chest. Not of victory, but of possibility. He still didn't fully understand how it had happened, but he knew the starting point was Margaret, in the way she saw the world and in the silent secret that was beginning to transform her mind. That night, Andrew came home with his shoulders held higher than usual. It wasn't exactly pride, but the strange feeling that maybe he wasn't the absolute failure Dad always claimed. Jonathan noticed the different glint in his son's eyes and, as usual, reacted coolly. During dinner, he asked dryly, "So, any new disasters at school?" Andrew hesitated, but then explained that he had received unexpected praise for an assignment. Jonathan dropped his cutlery on his plate and narrowed his eyes suspiciously. For him, the only explanation was cheating. "Don't make a fool of me, Andrew," he said in a low but cutting voice. "You've never written anything but blank answers. Where did that come from? Who did it for you?" Silence weighed heavily on the table. Andrew felt his stomach churn. Unable to admit that the inspiration came from the cleaning lady his father humiliated almost daily. Jonathan leaned his elbows on the table, staring at his son as if he could dismantle him with just a look. "You're incapable of surprising anyone on your own. So who's helping you?" The distrust stemmed not just from skepticism, but from the wounded pride of a man who wouldn't allow his control to be challenged. Andrew didn't answer. He simply looked down at his plate, trying to contain the anger and fear that were mingling within him. Jonathan, convinced his son was hiding something, decided to investigate on his own. And, unbeknownst to Andrew, the shadow of this control about to fall upon him could reveal secrets that would change the dynamics of the mansion. The tycoon didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that the wisdom beginning to transform the heir didn't come from expensive books or renowned professors, but from the woman he despised most in his household. It didn't take long for Jonathan to discover that Margaret's constant presence around his son was no coincidence. One morning, passing by the library, he caught Andrew sitting across from her, listening intently as the cleaning lady showed him some notes in her notebook. The tycoon stopped in the doorway, his face hard as stone. He entered unannounced and snatched the notebook from Margaret's hands with a brusque gesture. "Is that it?" he said in a tone thick with contempt. "Is this how you've been fooling my son? By stuffing this nonsense into his head?" Andrew stood up immediately, trying to intervene, but Jonathan's voice was louder. "I pay you to clean the floor, not to play teacher," he snapped, each word laced with venom. Margaret stood her ground, her head unbowed. Her eyes met his, and though her body trembled, her dignity remained intact. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore," she replied calmly, "I'm not deceiving anyone. I'm simply showing your son that the world can be seen differently." Jonathan gave a dry laugh, as if the very idea were ridiculous. "Observed? What can an uneducated cleaning lady teach my heir?" Andrew, fired with a courage he'd never possessed, stepped forward. "More than all the tutors you've hired," he said, his voice firm despite his racing heart. Jonathan turned slowly to his son, surprised by the boldness. The silence that fell was heavier than any shout. For the first time, the barrier of unquestionable authority surrounding Jonathan was beginning to be scratched. And, though he wouldn't admit it, something about the scene deeply disturbed him, because the strength Margaret derived from wasn't the books he despised, but the conviction no amount of money could buy. The air in the library seemed charged with tension, as if even the ancient books were witnessing the clash. Jonathan stared at his son, waiting for him to back down as he always did. But Andrew didn't look away. For the first time, he raised his voice, not to justify himself, but to defend someone everyone considered invisible. "You're always saying I'm a failure, that I don't learn anything," he began, his heart hammering in his chest. "But the truth is, I never found a reason to try, until I realized that someone here in your house sees what even you can't." Jonathan laughed, but there was something forced in it. "Are you going to tell me I should thank the cleaning lady for academic miracles?" Andrew clenched his fists, summoning all the courage accumulated over weeks of silence. "It's not a miracle. It's just that she showed me that learning isn't about repeating words from books. It's about understanding what's behind them. She taught me how to look. And just by looking differently, Dad, I've gotten more than years of expensive tutors." With each sentence, Jonathan felt the authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. Margaret, standing nearby, remained silent, but in her eyes was quiet pride. For a moment, Jonathan didn't know what to say. His arrogance had always given him the tools to humiliate or silence anyone. But here was his own son challenging him with words laden with conviction. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. Jonathan turned and left the library, striding firmly, but without the victory he'd hoped for. Andrew took a deep breath, feeling his legs tremble, but also an unexpected relief. He had defended Margaret, and, more than that, he had defended himself. What he didn't yet know was that this confrontation would only be the beginning of a silent war within the Whitmore mansion. After the confrontation, Andrew began to seek Margaret's company even more, as if each encounter were a refuge from his father's coldness. One afternoon, they met again in the library, the same place where everything had exploded days before. Silence hung in the air, but this time there was no fear. Margaret opened the notebook Jonathan had snatched from her hands and showed a page of simple drawings. Leaves, rivers, intersecting lines. "The world talks to us all the time, Andrew," he said calmly. "Except most of us are too busy to listen." Andrew flipped through the pages, intrigued. There were comparisons between the strength of steel and the silent strength of a root, between the movement of the stars and the rhythm of human decisions. It wasn't science in the academic sense, but it was the logic of life. That makes sense," he murmured, his eyes shining. Margaret smiled slightly. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about understanding stories. Everything carries a lesson. If you learn to see the connections, you can turn failures into learning. Andrew felt his heart race. No one had ever shown him that learning could be this alive. He realized that this was Margaret's true secret. The ability to see beyond the obvious, to find lessons in the simplest things. There were no framed diplomas on her wall, but there was a practical wisdom that no tutor had been able to impart. Andrew closed his notebook and took a deep breath, as if something inside him had finally clicked. For the first time, he saw himself not as incapable, but as someone who could learn. He just had to look at it differently. The secret, which until then had seemed unattainable, was right in front of him, revealed by the least expected person. The school calendar moved relentlessly forward, and finals week approached like an inevitable storm. Andrew felt the weight of expectation looming over him. But this time, it wasn't just fear. There was a spark of hope within him, born from silent conversations with Margaret. The night before the first exam, she found him in the garden, sitting in the dim light of a lantern. "Don't worry about your grades," she said softly, handing him a blank sheet of paper. "Write here everything you saw these past few days. Not what you memorized, but what you actually saw." Andrew hesitated, but began to write. When he finished, he realized that, for the first time, he wasn't repeating words, he was telling stories. The next day, as he entered the classroom, his heart raced. The history test loomed large before him. Pages filled with questions, empty lines clamoring for answers. But instead of panicking, Andrew remembered Margaret's lessons. He didn't respond with canned phrases, but with connections. When writing about the Industrial Revolution, he didn't limit himself to dates and names. He spoke of the sweat of workers, compared machines to the human heart, and described how progress can crush or elevate lives. Each answer was less an academic exercise and more a narrative that connected facts with meaning. The hours flew by, and when he handed in his test, he felt a strange sense of peace. The teacher watched him with raised eyebrows, surprised by the concentration he'd never seen in him before. Andrew left the room with shaky legs but a firm chest. For the first time, it didn't matter to him whether he got an A or a C. What mattered was that he'd managed to tackle something that had previously seemed impossible. And deep down, he knew this was only the first step. There would still be a verdict, and that verdict would come not only from the school, but also from Jonathan, who was already eagerly awaiting to see if his son would finally break the cycle of failure. Jonathan received the partial report card even before Andrew. The envelope lay on his mahogany desk, heavy as if it held a sentence. Opening it, his eyes scanned the grades in disbelief. No reds, no disasters. History, B. Literature, B-. Science, C+, Math, C. To any other parent, it would be a relief, perhaps even a source of pride. But to Jonathan, it sounded impossible. "How?" he murmured, his fingers tightening around the paper. Where did this come from? His instinct wasn't to celebrate, but to be suspicious. In his mind, there was no way his son could have done it alone. That night, during dinner, Jonathan stared at Andrew in silence, trying to decipher every gesture. "Those grades," he said suddenly, his voice low but sharp. "Did you get them on your own?" Andrew, with newfound courage, nodded without hesitation. "I studied. I changed the way I look at things." Jonathan let out a dry laugh, a laugh of incredulity. "Don't be ridiculous. You never achieved anything on your own. Someone is behind this." Andrew felt his face heat up, but replied, "If I learned anything, it was because someone showed me that knowledge isn't found in expensive books, but in the way you see life." The silence that followed was piercing. Jonathan dropped his cutlery onto his plate, his eyes flashing with anger. The mere idea that the cleaning lady might have taught his son something he, with all his might, had failed to do, cut through his pride like blades. For Jonathan, there was no greater affront than admitting that value could come from someone he had always considered insignificant. Inside, his arrogance clashed with a growing shadow of fear. What if he was, in fact, losing control over everything he had thought unquestionable? Jonathan spent days in silence, watching Andrew as if watching an invisible enemy. With each firmer response from his son, with each new sign of autonomy, the tycoon's heart sank. He wondered how it was possible that a boy who had always seemed empty now displayed clarity, almost a sparkle in his eyes. What disturbed him most was the realization that the source of this change lay not in his influence, nor in his expensive tutors, but in the woman he had always humiliated. The cleaning lady, with her work-scarred hands, had reached where all the power of the Whitmore name had failed. One rainy afternoon, Jonathan found Margaret in the main hall, picking wilted flowers from their vases. He stood before her, his usual arrogant tone gone. There was something different in his expression, a heaviness he could no longer hide. "Do you truly believe you've changed my son?" he asked, trying to sound firm, but his voice faltered. Margaret looked up and replied simply, "I haven't changed anything, sir. I've only shown him that the world is full of signs. He's the one who chose to see them." The words pierced Jonathan like a truth impossible to deny. For the first time, he found no answer. That night, seeing Andrew studying without anyone forcing him, Jonathan felt a strange mixture of pride and shame. Pride in his son's progress, shame for not having been able to guide him. He approached slowly, stopped at the door and said, "Andrew, go on." They were just 2 words, but they carried more meaning than any speech. The boy looked up and, seeing his father stripped of the armor of arrogance, realized that perhaps there was room to rebuild something between them. Jonathan, though unable to admit it aloud, was beginning to recognize the hidden greatness in this woman he had always belittled. The following weeks brought visible changes. Andrew, previously apathetic, now participated in class, asked questions, and surprised teachers who had previously considered him a lost cause. The young man who had previously hidden behind the Whitmore surname began to build his own identity, sustained not by family money but by newfound confidence. Each achievement, no matter how small, felt like a silent victory against the fate of failure that seemed written for him. In the mansion, the mood had also changed. Jonathan, even though he maintained his rigid posture, could no longer look at Margaret the same way. Every time he saw her working, he remembered how she had reached his son where he, with all his power and wealth, had failed. It was a wound to his pride, but also a hard lesson to swallow. Greatness is not measured by titles, but by the ability to transform lives. Margaret remained discreet, but now her footsteps echoed with a respect previously denied her. On a golden afternoon at sunset, Andrew walked through the garden and found Margaret watering the flowers. He approached and, with a genuine smile, said, "You didn't just help me pass my exams. You taught me how to see the world." She smiled silently, certain that the true victory lay not in the grades, but in the awakening of that boy. And although Jonathan was never the type of man to admit it out loud, within him grew the certainty that he owed her more than any fortune could repay. The Whitmore family would never be the same, all because the most despised voice in that house had revealed the secret that would change everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any inspiring videos, and, of course, leave a like, because it really helps the channel continue to bring you moving stories like this. Thank you so much for your support.